Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Market Wrap. So I am back in Philly. I had a great weekend watching the NCAA tournament, but more importantly, Giants made a big free agent move, signing Galladay. We desperately needed the receiver, can't wait to get him on the team. So this week we saw three really nice watches come through, and the first one is a brand we don't talk enough about, and that's Jaeger-LeCoultre. And this is a classic Reverso. It's one of my favorite versions. It's the 18 karat rose gold. It's got a beautiful kind of ivory dial on the front, gray on the back. Just a beautiful classic watch. Hard not to appreciate that one. The second piece is a Patek Philippe, but again, not your traditional dress Patek Philippe, but the chronograph, the 5968A. It's a great shape, it's a good size. Love the touch of orange on the hand, love the orange strap. Just a beautiful stainless steel chrono, one we rarely see used. And the last piece we got was a Ressence. Now Ressence is a very small brand. This particular one is their Type 1X. It was a limited edition they did for their 10th anniversary. They only made 40 pieces, so obviously we don't get to see a lot of these, but just a kind of a cool, funky green. I love the brand. I love Benoit's passion. I know that one won't last very long. So we had a great conversation on Clubhouse on Monday, and after some Rolex chat, we quickly pivoted to Lange and their new retail policies. Now, for those of you who don't know, they're making all their complicated watches, basically anything from the 1815 chrono on up, to become application pieces. Now, this basically means their retailers will not be able to hold the watches in stock, but submit the client's name and request the piece to be sold. The factory either approves or denies the request. Now, this is obviously a big change for a brand like Lange. The brand is trying to make sure that the clients aren't trying to play one dealer against the other. They're also trying to make sure the pieces go to the right wrist and at the right price. Now, I believe all of this is basically a reaction to the brand finally having a watch that trades over retail. And managing that demand is always a challenge for retailers. Now, that being said, I'm not a big fan of the practice of making somebody buy another Lange to get on the Odysseus list. I don't think that makes sense. I believe it is the rights of a brand to be either say no gracefully or allocate a piece if it's the right client. But making conditional buys, I don't think is a great idea. So lately we've been talking a lot about big brands, and I thought this week we should spend some time talking about some of the lesser known brands. Now here at Watchbox, we have an incredible team of watch people throughout the world. And one very special person is our man in Switzerland, Patrick Hoffman. Now Patrick's been in the watch business even longer than me. He was the CEO of Ulysses Nardin for a number of years. He knows more about the inner workings of the Swiss industry than anyone I know. So I thought it'd be great fun to see how some of the lesser known brands are faring kind of almost post-COVID and what he expects to see with them over the next year or two. So Patrick, thanks for joining us on this week's Market Wrap. I'd love to get some feedback on what you're seeing on the ground, especially from some of the small brands that I know you're very friendly with.
Well, I'm in the middle of it here in Switzerland, and thank you for having me. I see a real trend, if you can call it a trend, towards those smaller independent brands. And many of those, I think, are undervalued because they don't get probably the exposure which they should get sometimes in the press and maybe even through some retailers. But I see that the end consumers, they see the details, they look for something special, they look for unique pieces, which they probably also consider a bit of their luxury life. So there are a few brands which I have in mind, which I am in contact quite a bit. One of them is Chronoswiss. I'm sure you're familiar with that name. It's, in my opinion, a great brand which is undervalued. They have a rich history, only a short history. I mean, they were born in 1983. They went a bit through a shock after 2012 with the new ownership. But I think now they really got the grasp on it. They found a new way, keeping the DNA alive and really bringing back the brand on a global level again.
I loved Chronoswiss. I used to love the skeleton chrono they used to do back in the early 90s. I remember selling them, and there was a very cool, great value brand back then. I think that's a great piece. And we don't hear a lot about them today, especially here in the States. I know you always bring it up to me, and I'm like, you're right, it is a great brand, something we should keep an eye on.
I think it needs more exposure, and that Opus model, which you just mentioned, everybody always comes up when I mention Chronoswiss. They always mention that skeletonized Opus. That's just one of their lines which they have. And I just want to mention one thing about Chronoswiss. It's a brand which was always mechanical. It was never a quartz watch, and the founder in 1983 was one of the few visionaries who actually realized that the future will be with mechanical watches. And that really is a good point about Chronoswiss.
Oh, I love that. All right, so what's your second pick for us?
Well, the second pick is, I have to admit, is a good friend of mine. He and I, we share the same car dealership, you know. It's also a passion besides watches, and that's how we actually met. We didn't even match through the trade. It's the brand Louis Monet. And the owner is not a watchmaker. I would call him, he is like a master chef, a cook. He finds the right ingredients to really come up with watches which are different, which I would say polarizing. I like polarizing brands and I like polarizing models, and Louis Monet definitely is one of those. It's a young brand, a revived brand. It's actually said, and it's probably also the truth that Louis Monet was the first one to produce a chronograph.
Chronograph,
actually.
right?
That's 200 years ago, 1816 or something like that.
No, I love to see the rich history come back in, and they do have some very cool models. So I love that. All right, third and final pick. What's it going to be?
Third and final pick, that's a real gentleman, Kari Voutilainen. I can't even go to how many prizes the guy won over the last 10 years. It must be, I think, 8 to 10 Grand Prix of Genève over the last few years. It's incredible. Now, what I like about Voutilainen is it's not only about the mechanics. He really looks into some techniques, and we call it the masterpieces, techniques in enameling, techniques in details of the dials. So it's not just about the mechanics with him, it's also about the aesthetics and long historical professions which are revived, which almost were discontinued or disappeared in the watch industry.
I think that's an amazing pick because, again, we know him in the industry because of the recognition he's gotten, but commercially and in the public, I don't think he's certainly as well known as some of the other, considered one of the finest watchmakers in the world that you don't hear about a lot, certainly not in the States. So as expected, I always learn a ton from my talks with Patrick, and we will try to check in with him regularly to get the pulse of what's going on the ground in Switzerland. So the last thing we're going to talk about is what we're buying. The first piece is a very classic Patek. It's the 5119J. Now, currently, Patek does not have any hobnail Calatravas in the collection. I can't remember ever saying that before, so these are always kind of classic, iconic watches we're looking for. It's a great piece. The second piece is the Lange, but not my typical Lange. It's the Datograph Perpetual. Now, the Datagraphs have strengthened, the Zeitwerks have strengthened, but the Dato Perpetuals are still, I believe, really overlooked. It's always something I'm looking to trade in. The last piece we're going to talk about is the 116506, the Platinum Daytona. Now, if you've got a Platinum Daytona, you were certainly in the positive side of trading. The prices have gone through the roof. They are trading right around $100,000 right now. I don't know if it's going to last at this level, but certainly if it's something you're not getting a lot of use of, something you might want to make a trade on today. So that was this week's Market Wrap. Look forward to seeing you next week.